What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be diving deep into controller settings for Battlefield 6 since they are quite complex. There's a whole lot going on here, and I know it can be very overwhelming. Now, I did make a similar video to this for the beta. However, I noticed right away after copying those settings over, it felt very different from what I experienced in the beta. So I actually made a good handful of key adjustments from that beta video that I made that feel much better in the full launch of the game. Now, a few really quick disclaimers here to cover. First off, I'm primarily just focusing on infantry aiming. We're not really getting into vehicle settings with this video. That's something I may cover down the road. And also, just like with any settings video, at the end of the day, these come down to preference. And that's why this is designed to be more of a guide rather than just trust me, bro, copy these settings, everything's gonna be perfect for you. I'll be sharing the settings that I've landed on that are working really well for myself, but also, when applicable, what the setting actually means, how it works, and what happens if you go up or down or on or off with that particular setting. So I really want to make sure that I'm just helping you guys make informed adjustments to your own settings to better suit you, which I highly recommend doing. For some of you, maybe just copying and pasting these one-to-one is going to feel amazing and you won't have to touch anything. But I think for most people, their best settings are going to require some adjustments from mine. And with that out of the way, let's dive right into it, skipping over the accessibility settings since all the key ones can be accessed later on as we get through this video. Let's get into our gameplay settings. And the first thing is the hold toggle options. We want to go to edit here. And for me, I personally like prioritizing reload. You guys might like something totally different. That's fine. But for me, the way I see it is I'm going to be reloading far more than I'm ever going to be interacting with anything. And therefore, I want that reload to be as responsive as possible. I don't want to have to hold down the button to reload. And then if I want to interact with something like a zip line or something, for instance, then I just have to hold the button for that, and I'm not going to be doing that nearly as often. Then after that, a bunch of these settings are also redundant. They're going to show up in our controller settings, so let's just skip over to the controller settings. That's what most of you guys are here for anyway. And when you select controller settings, you'll see this screen pop up. Something that was confusing a lot of people in the beta is how to get to the next option, and on PlayStation at least, it's going to be triangle. That'll be Y on Xbox. If you press that, then you get into the actual settings that you want to get to here. And our primary focus is going to be on these infantry settings. And what I found with the full build of the game is I had to drop my aim sensitivity a fair amount compared to the beta, just because it feels very different from the beta for me at least. So I'm using 60. And this is our base aim sensitivity value that basically everything else after this is going to be based on. As for our field of view, I personally like 105. I find that's a nice balance. With FOV, of course, the lower you go, the more you're going to be zoomed in by default, which means targets at a distance will appear larger, they'll be easier to spot, but you lose a lot of your peripheral vision, and you won't be able to see nearly as much going on around you as if you had a very high field of view. Additionally, the thing I like about a higher field of view is it will give you the appearance of reduced recoil. The more you're zoomed in, the more movement you're going to be seeing when firing your gun. So this is another reason that many people like going with a bit of a higher field of view, even though it's purely visual. Now, let's talk about our vertical aim ratio. With this setting, it controls your vertical sensitivity versus your horizontal sensitivity. And if you want a perfect balance between the two, for the vast majority of you out there, you'll be playing on a 16:9 screen. If you want to get that perfect balance, 9 divided by 16 equals 0.5625, and therefore 56.2 or 56.3. That will give you essentially a perfectly balanced vertical versus horizontal sensitivity. Your aim will feel the same up and down versus left and right. For me, I've actually found dropping this value a little bit is more comfortable. So my vertical sensitivity will be a little bit lower. A lot of games do this by default. They already have this sort of multiplier built in, so vertical will be reduced. Because when playing an FPS game, generally speaking, you're going to want to aim left and right faster than up and down. And by lowering this value, I find it actually gives a little bit finer control over recoil control. Because that's where a lot of your vertical aiming is going to come in, is when you're trying to control recoil. So this is why, for me, I've settled on 45, but many of you guys may want that balance at 56.3. One thing I'll say here is I don't recommend going any higher than 56.3. It's really awkward to have a faster vertical sensitivity than horizontal sensitivity. I can't really think of any situation where that's something you would want to have. Now after that, let's talk about one of the most confusing settings for a lot of people when it comes to aiming. This is uniform infantry aiming. With this, if you leave this value on, what this system is essentially doing is trying to balance how your sensitivity reacts depending on the zoom level of the optic that you're using to try to give you a more consistent feel regardless of the zoom setting. Because if you don't have this on and you don't change any other settings, the more you zoom in, the slower your aim is going to be able to react, relatively speaking, in the world. So it's going to take you way, way longer to do a 360-degree turn with a high zoom optic compared to a lower zoom optic. And by default, this is set to 178. This is once again tied to the most common aspect ratio these days, which is 16:9. And 16/9 is 1.7 repeating, or 1.78. So that's why that value is set there. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is the perfect setting for you. And also, a common misunderstanding here is that when it's set to this sort of quote-unquote correct value for your aspect ratio, that you're going to have the exact same sensitivity feel with a low zoom optic versus a high zoom optic, and that's not the case. You will still be turning around slower with a high zoom optic compared to a lower zoom optic. So let's look at the other extremes. If you set this all the way down to 1, a very, very low setting, your sensitivity is going to be a lot slower, so you're going to be spinning a lot slower with a high zoom optic versus a low zoom optic. Whereas if we were to increase this coefficient all the way up to the maximum value of 300, this significantly reduces the gap, so your high zoom optic will react much faster, relatively speaking, to your low zoom optic. Although, even with this value completely maxed out, you're still going to be turning around slower with a high zoom optic compared to a low zoom optic. It's just the gap between those two shrinks pretty drastically. So what does this mean for you? If you are going to be using this setting, it's really just going to come down to personal preference. I would recommend playing around on the firing range with different levels of zoom. So change your optic up, try to shoot some targets, and just find out what feels best for you. If it feels like the high zoom optics are reacting too slow, increase this value. If it feels like they're reacting too fast and you don't have enough control over your aim, then decrease this value. I think 178 is a good starting point to build from. And for many, it might be the perfect setting for you, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't consider making some adjustments to this value. Now, in saying all of that about uniform infantry aiming, I might be a little bit weird here. I don't like having this on. I just like making manual adjustments on a per zoom basis on my own. I think that's just due to my history of FPS gaming. I'm just much more comfortable not having a system in the background trying to do this for me, and I'd rather take full control over that for myself. So use it if you want, and I'd recommend maybe playing around with it a bit, but I leave this off, and we'll get into my deeper per zoom settings in just a little bit. But before we do that, I felt this video was the perfect time to announce my new controller partner, AIM Controllers. This isn't a sponsored video, so they're not paying for this. I don't have a script that I have to follow or anything, but I do have my own discount code with them now, and for any sale using my discount code, of course, I get a kickback from that. So full disclosure there. But I've never partnered with a controller company before. AIM reached out and they wanted me to try out their controller. I've got quite a few hours on it now. I've got a really good feel for it, and I'm loving a bunch of the features that they had to offer. The main one, and the main reason I was even interested in finally taking a controller partner here, is the TMR analog sticks. These are a huge step up from the default analog sticks, and a step up from Hall effects as well, depending on who you ask, but you're gonna get a lot more accuracy and precision compared to Hall effect, with the benefits of not having to worry about stick drift, which is typically the #1 point of failure on a controller, at least in my experience over the years. I will use a controller until it gets stick drift, and then it's time for a new one. So it's nice to not have to worry about that with the TMR sticks. Also, AIM controllers are officially licensed Sony and Xbox controllers as a base, so they're not modded controllers with cheats installed or anything, and they offer a lifetime warranty. So if you guys are interested in checking out a premium controller, I only scratched the surface here. There are a lot of other options you can add on top of it, but the #1 I'd recommend is the TMR sticks. If you're interested, I will leave my special affiliate link down below, or you can use the code ACE at checkout for a discount. Now, getting back to the settings, let's talk about aim assist a little bit. And with these, I just see no reason to not leave these maxed out at 100%. I mean, if you feel like it's too strong, sure, feel free to lower it, but I think for most people, they'll just want this maxed out. One thing that's worth noting, they still haven't removed the infantry aim assist zoom snap setting, even though that's not a setting that's actually active in the game. So just know that it doesn't matter what you do with that value, it won't change anything in game. And now let's talk about our aim input curves. With these, they determine how your sensitivity will accelerate or how it responds with input. So how fast will your sensitivity ramp up, for instance, with a little bit of movement on your stick versus a lot of movement on your stick. And while they don't show the graphs here, they do show the graphs for all of these in Battlefield 2042. So I'm just going to overlay them on right here so you can see what that acceleration curve looks like. And honestly, for most of these, they're basically the exact same thing. The average player wouldn't be able to tell the difference between these whatsoever, outside of the outliers like Battlefield Bad Company 2 or Linear, for instance. For me, I'm honestly just happy with standard. It's a nice balanced curve, it works well for me, and I've been finding a lot of success with it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't play around with some other settings though. For some of you, you'll like something a bit different. Now, let's talk about our aiming left-right acceleration. With this, it only applies when you're aiming down sight, and it's determining how quickly your aim is going to ramp up to your maximum sensitivity value So if you want to do a 180, for instance, it's not going to be determining your overall sensitivity for that full 180 degree turn. It's only determining how quickly you ramp up to get to that sensitivity value. And it might sound counterintuitive, but the lower this value is, the faster that acceleration is going to feel. So it'll feel a lot more responsive. However, you may find that you lose some fine control over your aim in that case, because it'll be too responsive for some people. Whereas with a really high value, it's going to react a little bit slower, a little bit more sluggishly to get up to your maximum turn speed given your sensitivity value. And for me, I find that to be too sluggish. And so what I've landed on is 25. I like it fairly fast, but not all the way down to 0, where it's just a little too responsive for my liking. And I just feel I lose a bit too much fine control there. Next up, scrolling down, we're going to skip over this slide setting because I'll get into the bindings in a little bit. Let's get into our infantry zoom aim sensitivity. And this is a value I would generally recommend lowering because this determines how your aim is going to react relative to your standard infantry sensitivity that we set up already. This determines what happens once you aim down sight. And by lowering this value, you're lowering your sensitivity, but only when aiming down sight, which generally you want to do because that will give you finer control over your aim and your recoil control when aiming down sight. Whereas without aiming down sight, it allows you to turn relatively faster. So if somebody gets behind you or beside you, for instance, you can come out of aiming down sight and quickly turn to react to that situation. So for me, for this value, I like setting that at 80, and then I make further adjustments on a per zoom basis. But before we get into that, we have our zoom transition sensitivity smoothing. If you leave this on, which is by default, if you're turning your aim while in the process of aiming down sight, it will gradually adjust your sensitivity from your hip fire sensitivity into your aim down sight sensitivity, which in this case, because we set ours at 80, it's going to be noticeably slower. So you'll notice a gradual slowdown while you're in the process of aiming down sight. If you turn this off, the moment you initiate aiming down sight, it will immediately give you your aim down sight sensitivity. And for me, I prefer that instant transition. It just feels more comfortable to me in this game, so I have turned that off. Now, when it comes to my per zoom sensitivity values, the way I handle this is for anything from a 1 multiplier up to a 2.5 multiplier, I like reducing this down to 0.75, giving me even more fine control over my aim and recoil control when aiming down sight. And generally speaking, with most regular full auto guns in this game, 2.5x is likely the highest I will typically go. However, if I want to get to that mid-range from a 3 zoom up to a 4 zoom, since I'm not using uniform infantry aiming, I find that my sensitivity just reacts too slowly, so I've bumped these up just a little bit up to 80. Then for 4.5 and 5, I just leave this at 100. And then finally, for 6x and up, I actually like increasing this value a little bit because in these situations, I'm going to be using a sniper rifle. And with a sniper rifle, I don't need a lot of fine control over recoil. I need to just get onto target and pull the trigger. And I like having the ability to flick a little bit more. I also like having the ability to properly track targets that are moving perpendicular to me. And if I don't set this at a higher value, then I often find that I just can't keep up and track those targets because my sensitivity is way too slow. So that's why I actually increase these a little bit to make them snappier and more responsive. Now, if you are using that uniform infantry aim, you might not want to touch any of these zoom settings at all, but this is what I like doing because I feel like I just have full control over each zoom value. Now, after that, my interact and reload prioritizes reload. We already talked about that. I don't use motion sensor aiming at all, and I don't use the flick look option. This is something you have to manually map, so it's not on by default anyway, but if you map this to a button, you will automatically do a 180 degree turn, and this just allows you to tune those values. But again, like I said, I'm not using that option at all. Now let's have a look at our key bindings. So this is the infantry passenger control mapping. We're going to edit these and a few settings that I've adjusted. One of the key things here is I swap my ping button with my grenade button. So instead of ping being L1, grenade being R1, I swap those. Just because when aiming down sight, I'm already holding down the left trigger, and therefore pinging while aiming down sight, which typically you are going to be aiming down sight when pinging, it feels really awkward to also have to press a button on the left. So that's why I prefer this on R1, and then I don't mind my grenade being on L1. So that's a personal preference thing, but that made a really big difference for me, and I would recommend going that route for most people. After that, for both crouch and slide, I have these manually mapped to R3, so I don't have to take my thumb off the analog stick to crouch or slide. And that means I can maintain my aim while performing those actions. And then by default, that will overlap with melee, so I just swap melee to circle. Now after that, the only other thing I've changed here so far is my rangefinder zeroing if zoomed. With this, if you're using the rangefinder attachment on a sniper rifle, this is the button that will set the zero of your scope to the point that you're aiming at when you press this button. And by setting this to L3, this is my preference, the moment I hold my breath, that is also going to set my zero on my scope. And then I just have to put my sight right where I want my bullet to go and pull the trigger. Now, some people like mapping this to their aim button, so the moment they aim down sight, then it will also set their zero. The problem with this is sometimes you're aiming down sight a little off target first, or maybe you're transitioning from one target to the next. So I find this just gives a little more control, and that's why I like mapping it in that way. And that's it for the mapping changes that I've made. Now let's scroll all the way down here. You don't want to miss these settings at all. This is the controller tuning settings. These are absolutely vital to be adjusting. And with this, I don't like controller vibration. I find it to be an unnecessary distraction, so I turn that off. I also turn off my adaptive triggers entirely. Next, let's get into our dead zone settings, and we're gonna focus on our center dead zones first. This determines how much you have to move your analog stick before input is registered. And you definitely don't want to go too high with this value because then it's going to feel like your controller is very unresponsive. Like it's going to feel like you've got a ton of input lag because the first little bit that you're moving your stick will do literally nothing for you. In saying that, for many, you don't want to go too low with this as well because then you will experience stick drift. And that's not a great experience as well. And to see if you have stick drift, just boot up the firing range, set your center dot where you want it, and then just don't touch your controller. Just put it down. If that dot or if your aim is moving at all, without any input, then you have stick drift. And I'd recommend setting these center dead zone values as low as possible without getting stick drift. Now for me, as I outlined earlier with my aim controller and the TMR sticks, I can set this value at literally 0, and you can see there is 0 stick drift whatsoever here. So that's a huge benefit. It's going to feel way more responsive because it immediately kicks in. There's no dead zone to be worrying about for that center dead zone. For most people with a standard style of analog stick, you're probably going to have this center dead zone setting around like a 2 to 4, somewhere in there, but it will depend on your controller. Now, let's talk about our axial dead zone. This determines how well you're able to stay on plane. So if I want to perform a perfect 360-degree turn without my aim drifting up and down a bunch, I want to set this value fairly high. The problem with that, though, is if you set this way too high, like at the maximum value, if you want to make an adjustment vertically to your aim while performing that spin, it's going to take a lot of vertical input on your stick to make that happen. And this can really harm you, especially with recoil control, because you want to be able to control that with fine adjustments to your stick. However, in saying that, going too low can also be detrimental because at that point, it often becomes far too responsive to the point where you find yourself just constantly having to make micro adjustments that you don't want to have to make. Oftentimes, we do want to spin on a perfect level plane, and we don't want our aim drifting up to the sky or down to the ground in the process. So there is a balance to be found here. By default, it's set at 6. That's a perfectly fine value. I actually like bumping this up just a little bit to 8. That's the value that's working well for me, and that's where I'm going to leave it at. As for our max input threshold, my recommendation is on the left stick. This is your movement stick. I actually like dropping this down a little bit because it'll make movement feel a bit more responsive. Just a little bit. I dropped this down to 70. If you go too low with this, you will lose the ability to have a really controlled walking experience if you want to walk really slowly. But 70 feels really nice and responsive for me. Whereas on the right stick, I don't like lowering this value. And the reason behind that is you then lose range of motion. And this is your aiming stick where you want to have as much range of motion as possible. So I do recommend leaving this one at 100. As for L2 and R2, I personally just leave these default. You may want to lower your max input threshold on these, but for me, I'm totally fine with them as is. And that finally wraps it up for all of the controller settings. However, I do want to go into some other key settings that I like making an adjustment to. So let's get into our graphics tab. Keeping in mind, I'm on PlayStation. This may look different depending on the platform that you're playing on. But for PlayStation, make sure you set this to performance mode, assuming you have a setup that's capable of getting greater than 60 FPS. Then for my field of view, as we said earlier, this is 105. I leave my weapon field of view at wide. And then let's talk about motion blur. I highly recommend turning these completely off. It may look a little more like cinematic and it might hide some performance hiccups here or there. But I find that you're also missing out on information because it's literally blurring the information on your screen. So I like turning those off entirely. Camera shake as well. It's cinematic, but not good for gameplay. So turn that as low as possible. It's a similar story with sprint camera bobbing. I want to reduce that motion as much as possible. So I actually turn this value on to reduce that. I also turn off chromatic aberration, vignette, as well as film grain, because all of these are, again, cinematic sort of things to make the game look cooler, but they don't make the game perform any better, and oftentimes they just make it more difficult to see what you're aiming and shooting at. As for our interface and HUD, I like turning off infantry HUD motion as well as vehicle HUD motion. Again, this is just one of those things where I don't like unnecessary movement on my screen at all, so I turn it off whenever possible. Then let's talk about the SOVIS filter a little bit. What this does is when turned on, it actually increases the contrast a little bit as well as the illumination on enemy character models, making them pop on your screen a lot more. So it's going to be a lot easier to spot enemies with the SOVIS filter turned on. In saying that, it does give more of an unrealistic look to your gameplay experience because enemy players will literally have a bit of a glowing effect to them. And so if you want the game to look as realistic and immersive as possible, then you may want to turn this filter off. But for anybody looking for peak gameplay performance, you'll want to leave this on. As for our advanced HUD settings, I made a few adjustments here. The first thing is I turned my minimap to the large size. And the reason behind that is the minimap is an incredibly important tool, and therefore I want it to be really prominently displayed on my screen. Additionally, this one may be a little bit controversial. I like setting my view distance on foot to 250. What this does is it will zoom out my minimap quite a bit, allowing me to see more of the map at any given time. But the trade-off with that being zoomed out is I do lose a bit of that precision, especially in close ranges. For me, that's a trade-off I'm happy to make, but that may not be for everyone. And now let's head back a screen, and we're gonna get to icons and indicator. For my icon intensity, I like cranking this up just a little bit, so I'm not missing out on important icons that are appearing. For me, I like 75, I don't like taking it way too far. Then we'll get into our HUD icon settings. And with this, something that I changed pretty much across the board is the icon opacity when zoomed or aiming down sight. I like dropping this value a little bit. So down to 80 for objective icons, same thing for friendly icons and squad icons. If I'm aimed down sight, I want these particular icons to fade away a little bit because at that point, I'm focusing on what I'm shooting at. I'm not focusing on where the objective is. I can focus on that when not aiming down sight. However, with enemy icons, I make sure that opacity is still at 100. By having this differentiation, this helps reduce the situations where you're aiming at an enemy player and you have a friendly that's across the map and you can see a blue dot where that friendly is, and it just happens to line up over the top of an enemy player as well. This just makes sure that that enemy icon really takes over and is displayed a lot more prominently, so it's less likely you're gonna have that hesitation and think, wait, is that a teammate? You'll know very quickly that's an enemy, shoot him. Now, in addition to that, you might have noticed I did reduce my friendly icon scale a bit as well, just because there's so many of them at any given time. I don't need them to be taking over the screen too much, so I just dropped that down to 90. Then getting back to our crosshairs and indicators, let's go into that setting. For me, I like turning infantry crosshair projection off. And this just makes it so that hipfire icon in the center of your screen, it just remains static on the center of your screen. It doesn't move around as your character moves around. Then I actually like turning up my hit indicator intensity. That's 100% just a preference thing, but I really like making sure I see those hit markers displayed really prominently. Another key change I make here, I've seen a lot of people do this as well. I like turning my headshot color to a different color and something that stands out a lot, and yellow works really nice for me. And that's pretty much it for those settings as well. That now brings us into audio. And with this, I like turning down the Commander VO volume just so it doesn't take over any important gameplay audio that I need to hear, like footsteps, for instance. I also turn music volume off, but that's just because as a content creator, I'm often sitting in menus to record videos and I don't like having that music in the background. Then for the configuration here, I set this to headphones since I'm using headphones, and I like the high dynamics audio mix. I know a lot of people like using war tapes because it's a lot louder and maybe more immersive. It sounds like you're in a battle a little bit more, but you lose a lot of the intricacy of the audio by doing that. Whereas with high dynamics, you get as much separation there as possible, and I think that works the best for me at least, as far as hearing all of the details that I need to hear. And with that, this just leaves us with one last setting I'd recommend adjusting, and this is in the system settings. If you scroll down to network, I would recommend turning at least your scoreboard ping on, so that way when you open the scoreboard up in-game, you can see what your ping value is, as well as other people's ping value. So if you end up in a match where you have a really high ping, for instance, then you can see that and leave. Now, if you want to take that to the next level, you could turn the network graph on as well, and this will show you in real time on the top of your screen all of the network indicators and stuff. I found that's not really necessary. I like being able to check what my ping is. I don't necessarily need to see it displayed 24/7 while playing, so I leave that off now. And there we go. That's going to wrap it up for my settings guide. Those are all the settings that I've landed on so far for infantry. As I said, I may get into vehicle settings down the road. That's just something I haven't really played around with at all yet. And I want to make sure that I really take the time to dial those in. And with that, this is where I want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. First off, if you tried these settings, how are they working out for you? Were there any key adjustments that you needed to make that better suited you? And also, are there just any other settings that I didn't cover today that you would recommend making an adjustment to? Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.